The rusted sign, half swallowed by the encroaching kudzu, read, Jericho Creek, population 17. A lie, of course. A cruel, mocking lie. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, the Jeep Wrangler bouncing over the rutted, overgrown logging road. Beside her, Ben, her boyfriend, navigated with a tattered map, his brow furrowed. According to this, Jericho Creek should be just around this bend, he said, his voice strained. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows of the gnarled trees that clawed at the sky. A chill, deeper than the autumn air, settled in Sarah's bones. They'd been warned. Locals at the last gas station, their eyes wide and their voices hushed, had told them to turn back. "Don't go down that road," the old woman behind the counter had croaked, her gaze fixed on something beyond the dusty shelves. "Ain't nothing good down there." But Ben, ever the adventurer, had dismissed it as small-town superstition. "We'll be fine," he'd said, a confident grin spreading across his face. "Just a shortcut to the Appalachian Trail. We'll be camping by the lake by nightfall." Now, with the sun fading and the road deteriorating into a barely discernible track, Sarah wasn't so sure. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and an unsettling silence pressed in, broken only by the crunch of the Jeep's tires on loose gravel. As they rounded the bend, the forest opened up, revealing a desolate clearing. In the center stood a cluster of dilapidated shacks, their windows boarded up, their roofs sagging. A single, flickering light bulb illuminated a porch swing swaying gently in the breeze, a macabre welcome. "Jericho Creek," Ben breathed, his voice a mix of awe and unease. Sarah stopped the Jeep, her heart pounding. "This doesn't feel right, Ben. We should turn back." "Don't be ridiculous," he scoffed, unbuckling his seatbelt. "We're here. Let's just find the trail and get out of here." They cautiously approached the nearest shack, the silence broken only by the creak of the porch swing and the rustling of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. The air was heavy with a metallic tang, a smell Sarah couldn't quite place. Ben tried the door, but it was locked. He peered through a crack in the boarded-up window, then recoiled, his face pale. I don't know what I saw," he stammered. A low, guttural growl echoed from the shadows behind the shacks. Sarah spun around, her eyes straining in the dim light. Two figures emerged, hulking and misshapen, their faces obscured by matted hair and dirt. Their eyes, however, glowed with a feral intensity. "Run!" Sarah screamed, grabbing Ben's arm and pulling him towards the Jeep. They scrambled into the vehicle, Sarah jamming the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. She slammed the Jeep into reverse, tires spinning, and careened back down the road. The figures were gaining on them, their long, loping strides eating up the distance. Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror, her blood turning to ice. They weren't human. Their limbs were too long, their bodies too distorted, their movements too unnatural. A rock slammed into the windshield, shattering the glass. Sarah screamed, swerving to avoid a fallen tree. The Jeep lurched, then careened off the road, crashing into the dense undergrowth. The impact knocked the wind out of Sarah. She struggled to regain her bearings, her ears ringing, her vision blurred. Ben was slumped beside her, unconscious. The figures were upon them. They dragged Ben from the Jeep, their grunts and snarls echoing through the forest. Sarah, her heart pounding like a drum, managed to crawl out the other side, her body aching, her mind reeling. She stumbled through the trees, the sounds of Ben's screams fading into the distance. She didn't dare look back. She had to find help. She had to escape. The forest was a labyrinth of tangled vines and gnarled roots. Sarah tripped and fell, her hands sinking into the damp earth. She looked up, her breath catching in her throat. A figure stood before her, silhouetted against the fading light. It was taller than the others, its body even more grotesque, its face a mask of twisted flesh and bone. In its hand, it held a rusty machete. Sarah screamed, scrambling backwards, her eyes wide with terror. The figure lunged, the machete flashing in the darkness. She ducked, the blade slicing through the air inches from her face. She turned and ran, her legs burning, her lungs screaming for air. The figure pursued her, its heavy footsteps pounding on the forest floor. She stumbled upon a narrow path, barely visible in the darkness. She followed it, her heart pounding in her ears, her mind filled with images of Ben's mangled body. The path led to a clearing, where a single dilapidated cabin stood in the center. A light flickered in the window, a beacon in the darkness. Sarah rushed towards the cabin, her hope rekindled. She burst through the door, her eyes scanning the dimly lit interior. An old woman sat in a rocking chair by the fireplace, her face etched with wrinkles, her eyes as dark and empty as the night. She didn't turn to greet Sarah. "Help me," Sarah gasped, her voice hoarse. "They're after me. They took Ben." The old woman didn't respond. She continued to rock back and forth, her gaze fixed on the flames. "Please," Sarah pleaded, her voice trembling. "You have to help me." The old woman slowly turned her head, her eyes locking onto Sarah's. A chilling smile spread across her face, revealing blackened teeth. "They're family," she croaked, her voice raspy and low. "And you're trespassing." Sarah's blood ran cold. She realized the truth. The old woman was one of them. She was their matriarch. The door behind Sarah slammed shut. The cabin was filled with the sounds of heavy footsteps and guttural growls. The figures had found her. She turned to face them, her eyes filled with despair. They were even more grotesque in the dim light of the cabin, their bodies twisted and deformed, their eyes burning with a hunger that chilled Sarah to the bone. The old woman rose from her chair, a rusty shotgun clutched in her gnarled hands. "Welcome to Jericho Creek," she hissed, her voice filled with malice. "You'll fit right in." The figures lunged, their hands reaching for Sarah, their eyes filled with a primal hunger. She screamed, her voice lost in the cacophony of snarls and grunts. The cabin became a scene of unimaginable horror. The screams of the dying, the sounds of tearing flesh and breaking bones filled the night air. The next morning, the sun rose over Jericho Creek, casting a pale light on the desolate clearing. The dilapidated shacks stood silent, their secrets hidden in the shadows. A lone Jeep Wrangler sat abandoned in the undergrowth, its windshield shattered, its interior stained with blood. The old woman sat on the porch swing, rocking gently back and forth, a satisfied smile on her face. The air was thick with the scent of blood and decay. A new sign, freshly painted, was nailed to a tree at the edge of the clearing. It read, "Jericho Creek, population 18. The road remained, an invitation for the unwary, a promise of a shortcut, a path to a nightmare. The whispering trees, the rustling leaves, and the silence of the forest held a dark secret, a tale of a wrong turn, a descent into madness, and the insatiable hunger of the family that waited in the shadows. And they always waited. The night was thick with fog, swallowing the winding road that cut through the dense forest. The headlights of Jack's car barely pierced the murky darkness as he drove, knuckles white against the steering wheel. He was supposed to meet his friends at the cabin by midnight, but a wrong turn had led him deep into unfamiliar territory. His GPS flickered and then lost signal entirely. The only sound was the rhythmic hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind whispered through the towering trees. Jack felt an unsettling chill creep down his spine. He glanced at the fuel gauge. Less than a quarter tank. "Great," he muttered under his breath. As he pressed forward, the road narrowed and the trees closed in, their skeletal branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Suddenly, a figure darted across the road. Jack slammed on the brakes, his heart hammering against his ribcage. He squinted into the fog, but there was nothing. Just the endless, oppressive darkness. "Get a grip," he told himself, shaking off the nerves. He continued driving, but the eerie sensation of being watched gnawed at him. The forest seemed alive, shadows twisting and dancing just beyond the reach of his headlights. Then he saw it. A decrepit, wooden sign barely hanging on a rusted post. Black Hollow. Jack's stomach tightened. He'd heard stories about Black Hollow, an abandoned village said to be cursed. People who ventured there never returned. He dismissed it as local folklore, but now, as the road led him deeper into the unknown, doubt began to fester. A sudden thud jolted the car. Jack swerved and skidded to a stop. He jumped out expecting to find an animal, but the road was empty. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. A distant sound echoed through the woods, soft, guttural whispers. Jack's breath quickened. "Hello?" he called out, but only the whispers answered, growing louder and more sinister. Panic set in. He turned back to the car, but the engine refused to start. He twisted the key repeatedly, but it only sputtered and died. Cursing, Jack grabbed his flashlight and ventured down the road, hoping to find help. The path led him to an ancient cemetery, tombstones crooked and crumbling, overgrown with ivy. In the pale light of the flashlight, Jack saw names etched into the stone, dates from centuries past. His eyes locked onto a fresh grave, the earth disturbed as if something had recently crawled out. A low growl rumbled from the shadows. Jack spun around, flashlight trembling in his grip. Red eyes glowed from the darkness, and a grotesque figure emerged, a twisted skeletal creature with rotting flesh and jagged claws. Jack stumbled backward, heart racing. He turned and ran, branches tearing at his clothes as he crashed through the forest. The creature pursued him, its guttural growls echoing in the night. In the distance, Jack spotted a dilapidated cabin with a faint light flickering inside. He sprinted toward it, throwing himself against the door and forcing it open. He slammed it shut and bolted it just as the creature's claws scraped against the wood. Inside, the cabin reeked of mold and decay. The walls were adorned with ancient symbols and candles burned with an eerie green flame. An old man sat in the corner, eyes sunken and hollow. "You shouldn't have come here," the old man rasped. "Black Hollow feeds on the lost." Jack backed away, fear gripping his chest. "What is that thing out there?" "The Guardian," the old man replied. "It protects the spirits bound to this cursed land. You took the wrong turn, and now you belong to Black Hollow." The door shuddered violently as the creature clawed at it. Jack looked around desperately for a way out. The old man simply laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the cabin. Jack grabbed a rusted poker from the fireplace and braced himself. The door burst open and the Guardian lunged. Jack swung the poker, striking the creature, but it barely flinched. It seized him with skeletal hands and dragged him toward the darkness. As Jack's screams faded into the night, the old man's laughter echoed through the forest. The fog thickened, swallowing the cabin and the road that led to Black Hollow. When Jack's friends arrived at the cabin the next morning, they found his car abandoned on the roadside. Of Jack, there was no sign. Only the whispers of the forest remained, carrying the chilling tale of a wrong turn that led to eternal darkness.